Thank you everyone for joining us on this rainy and cold Monday evening here in the New York City and in the mountains of Pennsylvania. I have a very special guest for us tonight. This is Michelle Bogre. Michelle Bogre, I met her in, I believe, around 2004, and she was at that time the chair of the photography department at Parsons. And I went into this office, which had just tons of books and a little manic. And she kind of became a professional mentor for me over the years. And at my former incarnation at B&H Photo, she really shaped a lot of the programs that I did. And she's just a great influence. And I want to thank Michelle immensely for that, being that professional influence over the years and helping with the career. Uh, She's also quite just an amazing, formidable photographer. She's a documentary photographer. She's a copyright lawyer. She's the author of 4 books, which one of them we're going to be talking about the second edition coming out tonight. She's really a true leader in progressive photography, concerned photography, and making images that really matter. So back in the day, at the event space at B&H Photo, Photography as Activism came out, and we did a book signing and a little book talk at the event space at B&H Photo. And then recently on social media, I saw that she had released the second edition of Photography as Activism. So I reached out and invited her to come onto the program. And here we are tonight, Photography as Activism by Michelle Bogre. Michelle, thank you for coming on to the show tonight.
Well, David, thank you. Your words are very kind. We enjoyed our relationship with B&H, and you were one of the first vendors who actually came and talked and said, how can we work together and what do you guys need? And I think it was a very productive, very long time we actually worked together. I want to thank everybody for coming and listening to me present about my book. I'm actually going to be kind of talking about some of the things that are in the book. So I'm going to be doing a little history of activism, why I wrote the book, and then I'm going to feature just a few of what I think are some of the more interesting projects in the book. So if you already know some about photo history, and this might be repetition or a review, and if you don't know it, then I think you'll learn some new things about activism. So the thing is, I first wrote the version of this book in 2010 because it seemed to me, as I met more documentary photographers, that they weren't all the same. There were some that seemed to go beyond just taking the picture and actually were unabashedly subjective. And I didn't see anyone who had actually ever differentiated documentary photography from photography as activism. So 12 years later, the second edition has come out, and honestly, it was actually harder to write than the first edition. A lot has changed, and those changes are represented in the new book. Today, photographers are more concerned with ethics. They're more concerned with agency of the person they're photographing. They're more concerned that the role that gaze and privilege play in the work they do. So I cover this in the book, and I also added new interviews and projects that probably fall more in the category of conceptual documentary. The first book was very reportage based. So the new book has a lot of new stuff in it because I've changed, and I think documentary photography has changed a lot. But before I continue, I think I want to define what I mean by photojournalism and what I mean by documentary. And by all means, you can disagree with my definitions, and we can even talk about that, but at least you'll know what I mean when I say it during this talk. So for me, photojournalism, which is actually my first career, my undergraduate degree was in photojournalism, and I worked at the Miami News early on in my career. Photojournalism and documentary are not the same. I think photojournalism is sort of a cousin or a subset of documentary because photojournalism is news. It has to adhere to far stricter standards and much more rigid ideas because there's a covenant in news between the viewer and the photographer that kind of says this is what it was. So you can't manipulate it on the scene, and you certainly can't manipulate it much in post-production. Documentary, I think, has a lot more latitude, particularly today. And my own definition, I think, is much more expansive. And how I defined it in the book is I said it begins with the idea of documentation because we're documenting something. onto which we layer the idea that the documentary image is not constructed, but it might be slightly staged or directed, that it can be poetic, that it bears a degree of witness and provides evidence, that it seeks truth and touches on reality, that it involves storytelling, it's intensely personal, and the photographer's intent is the substrate upon which the image exists. So that for me defines activist photography. We can, I should have done this slide. This is the book. This is the cover. It's an amazing image by Debbie Cornwall, and I'm going to talk about her at the end of the, I mean, she's one of the people I present at the end of the lecture. This is maybe defines activist photography, this old quote from Lewis Hine. There are two things I wanted to do. I wanted to show things that had to be corrected, and I wanted to show things that had to be appreciated. But as I thought about what's an activist, or what drives activism, I thought about philosophers that I had read in college, and they suggest, guys like John Locke, for example, suggest that activism is driven by the belief that everyone deserves equality and justice. And activism generally requires the characteristics of determination, often sacrifice, or the willingness to sacrifice, and the courage to take actions because you believe that in taking those actions, you might make changes in society that are directed toward a perceived public good. And so activist photographers are driven to try to affect social change. They willingly put themselves in very difficult and very dangerous situations to document the things, back to Lewis Hine, that need to be corrected and that need to be appreciated. And also, look, photography is the perfect activist medium. It records in exquisite detail what's in front of the lens. Let's take AI out of the conversation at the moment. It records in exquisite detail what is in front of the lens. And that link to humanity drives people to provoke an emotional response, and then we might do something. We see a photograph, we connect to humanity, and we think, yeah, I should donate to this cause. That's the role that activism plays, and that's the role that activist photography plays. So like, I would say, like, consider this word famine. It's a word, right? I suspect that everybody has a picture in their head, their favorite, I wouldn't say favorite famine picture, that kind of sounds macabre, but you have a picture that comes to mind when we say famine. And that's far more powerful than what this word could ever be. Maybe you thought of this famous James Noctway photograph. But imagine you're a wealthy Victorian person in 19th century England, and you've never seen an image of famine. You've heard that people starve, but you've never seen it because you're living in 19th century Victorian England. And then you see these photographs from photographer Willoughby Wallace Hooper from India, the Great Famine in India. I would just kind of make a little segue here. The title of this photograph is the kind of thing that we would never write today: deserving objects of gratuitous relief. He didn't even think that these were people, he called them objects. Now, photographers today may not even take this picture, but if they took this picture, they would actually speak to the people and they would have a sense of who they were. But this is the photograph you saw in Victorian England, or maybe you saw this picture. And these pictures that Hooper sent back actually raised a lot of money for famine relief in India, because for the first time someone said, oh my God, I have never seen that. I've never seen humans looking like that. Or maybe you've heard that there's terrible things going on in Belgium with King Leopold, but you've never seen it. And then Alice Seeley Harris, who was a missionary in Congo and took these photographs, comes back, and you see one of her lantern slides, and you see this picture of this man in a sala from Walla. He's looking at the hands and foot of his 5-year-old daughter. Or you see this picture of these two people. They've had their hands cut off because the soldiers wanted to claim that she was killed, because bullets were so expensive. If they killed somebody for either trying to steal from the company. They would cut their hand off, and they would take that back, and that was supposed to prove that they'd killed them, and that was what they'd spent the bullet on. But instead, they would hack the hands off of people to account for their bullet, but they would use the bullet on bushmeat or something they weren't supposed to use the bullet on. So Alice Seeley Harris was so appalled by what was going on in Congo. Oops, let me go back. That she, by the way, was photographing with an original small Brownie box camera, and she put together lantern slide lectures between 1904 and 1908, and she traveled around the UK and Europe to raise awareness. Her efforts were on behalf of an organization called the Congo Reform Association. They raised tens of thousands of pounds back then, which would be millions of dollars today. And eventually the public and political pressure from her continued advocacy and activism caused King Leopold to transfer his rights, or to transfer his control of the Congo to actually back to the Belgian government. So this is the kind of effect that photographs can have when coupled with activism and advocacy. And that's also one of the traits of the activist photographers I'm going to show today, is they create foundations, they give lectures, they continue to sort of push for the cause or the issue that they photograph. So these early activist photographers also played a role in the rising notion of what we call global human rights, defined simply as the inalienable rights that you derive simply from the fact that you're human. The idea of human rights emerged in the late 18th century and further developed in the 19th and 20th centuries as societies fought and debated about contentious issues like slavery, colonialism, and imperial rule. However, the early photographers or human rights photographers photographs also had and can have a negative effect, because they shaped ideas about race as the other. And today we would call that visual colonialism. But it's important, I think, as we look at historical pictures, even from our 21st century idea of what colonialism was and what visual colonialism was, we have to think that we read pictures differently today than we did then. And so we want to be critical of the colonial intent or the colonialism in the photographs, but we don't want to dismiss them. We should read them as historical records, but we kind of read them with the idea that we're reading them across historical time. And this is a wonderful idea that an amazing author and cultural historian named Mark Seeley, he lives in the UK, and he published a book called Decolonizing the Camera. And he was the first to raise the wonderful idea of reading images across historical time. He also suggested that we read a lot of the images, try to read them through a lens of other and of Blackness, as we both understand and appreciate the images for what they were when they were taken, but also apply a critical 21st century lens on them. And we'll do that as we look through some of the pictures. All right, so early activism. This is a wonderful quote, by the way, by another British photographer, and his visual violence is the impact caused by the constant, unrelenting, and dehumanizing way Black and brown skinned people are depicted visually. If it's not poverty, it's plight. If it's not plight, it's pain. If it's not pain, it's poverty. So he runs a wonderful blog called down here, The Black Gaze. So this plays along with Mark Seeley's idea of both photographs can both have a positive effect, and they can have a negative effect. So they can be both visually powerful and visually violent. So early activism, the very first probably activist photographs were taken by Hill and Adamson, a duo in the UK. Adamson was a painter, Hill was a painter and took up photography as a medium for sketching his paintings. Adamson was a chemist, and together the two of them formed one of the first portrait studios in the UK. making these beautiful calcite processes. They went to a small fishing village a little outside of Edinburgh, and they wanted to photograph the poverty there and in an attempt to try to raise money so that the fisher folk could buy better equipment, be safer in the boats. But because they couldn't actually go out in the boats, they kind of applied their same beautiful portrait aesthetic to the photographs they took of the people who were the kids or the women doing things, because the men were off in the boats. There's no evidence that they actually ever raised any money, but they produced this really extraordinary body of work, and it's kind of considered some of the first activists of social reform photography. John Adamson and Adolph Smith followed in their tradition when they embarked on a project as a writer-photographer duo called Street Life in London. They also wanted to photograph the poverty in London. They wanted to raise awareness because they always thought if only the other people, the rich Victorians, knew what was going on, they would care and they would give money to so that people didn't have to live the way they lived. This is, I think, one of Thompson's actually most famous photographs, and it's really quite amazing because to me, it's so visceral. You can almost feel what it would be like to try to sleep with your pillow as a stone cold pillar. And this woman was, they called them crawlers because they would like babysit for the children of a woman working in the pub, and they were so tired that they would crawl kind of when they were done begging for a cup of hot tea to put their very old used tea bag in. But Street Life in London was originally published and serialized, and it kind of became one of the best examples of social documentary photography, and probably was the precursor of Evans and Aggie's Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. As a genre, and its activist photography was central to the history of American photography in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as exemplified by photographers such as Jacob Riis and Louis Hine, who took photographs specifically to show social inequities. So Jacob Riis was a carpenter from Denmark. He came to the United States. He was living in the kind of squalor that he then came to photograph. More than 35% of the population in New York City at the time was foreign born, under or unemployed, living in the kind of squalid conditions that were almost unimaginable, or they were homeless. And Jacob Riis became obsessed with wanting to push forth housing reform so that people wouldn't have to live in these kinds of conditions. He started out as a reporter, decided photographs were far more powerful because they could show detail in a way that words couldn't describe. And so he would just go into situations. He used an magnesium flash because he wanted to be able to record the kind of details of a flash. He actually burned himself once because the magnesium flashes were very dangerous to use. He didn't really care about aesthetics. He didn't really care about the people. He kind of went in, took his picture, and left. But this is also one of his famous photographs, 5 cents a spot. This, I think, is pretty miraculous, pretty amazingly composed, considering he would go in the dark and do this flash. It's so crammed full that it feels claustrophobic. And these guys would literally pay 5 cents to sleep in this one spot that they had in this one room. I think, like activists today, Riis cared about solving the problem. His photographs appeared in a book, How the Other Half Lives. For almost 10 years, he lectured about the need for reform. He made lantern slides. He played music. He even tried to appeal to the Christian conscience of his audience by playing Christian music. Eventually, when Theodore Roosevelt read Rees's book and became the governor of New York, he worked with Rees to institute housing reforms. And that began with the tenement housing law of 1901. So Rees was probably one of the first examples of an activist who had a cause or an issue, who photographed it, who continued to lecture about it, to push for change, and had the effect of actually changing laws. And Lewis Hines sort of followed in his footsteps. And I love this quote: "If I could tell the story in words, I wouldn't need to lug around a camera." But like Rees, Hines decided that the photograph could tell the story in a way that words couldn't. Hines was as passionate about child labor reform as Rees was about housing reform. But in by 1910, more than 2 million children were working in factories and fields because there were absolutely no laws. So children as young as 5 were working. So Lewis Hine, because he was originally a sociologist, he also thought it was very important to humanize. So he took very copious notes and actually wrote captions, almost always with the person's name, how old they were, what they were doing, and how hard it was. He traveled more than 50,000 miles from Texas to Maine to document the conditions in which children worked, both in fields and in factories. He obviously was not welcome in factories, so he would do anything from bribing, lying, or tricking his way into places. He worked with a view camera and with natural light. He also, because he had taught photography, his images are far more aesthetic and probably more beautiful, let's say, than Jacob Riis. He also believed that if you got down on the eye level of a child, knowing as a photographer how point of view is important, you would force the viewer to connect directly with the child. So here, I think his captions are really interesting. Like, that Lacey is 12 and Savannah is 11, and they've worked in a factory as little spinners in a weaving factory for 2 years. And Savannah on the right looks like she's might have a spinal deformity, maybe from or work injuries, and her face looks wrinkled in pain. But he says, the little one is a crackerjack on spinning, the other one isn't so much. Having that kind of information, I think this is one of the things that photographers today are very conscious of, particularly with social media. You don't just go in, photograph something and leave. There's a sense of obligation and responsibility to actually name people, so that they become humanized, not just objects in a photograph. But this is also one of his most famous photographs, anemic little spinner. The other interesting thing about Riis's, I'm sorry, about Hines' captions is there was a writer named Joe Manning, a freelance journalist, and he actually went back many years later, and he tried to find some of the people that were identified in Lewis Hines' photograph. He found Addie Card. She had never escaped poverty. But like Riis, Hines relentlessly campaigned and did lectures and pushed for the need to change laws. And this is, one of the best kind of maybe proposing or prescient of the notion that we get sick of seeing these pictures. He said at a speech in Buffalo he was giving to reformers, he said, "Perhaps you were weary of child labor pictures. Well, so are the rest of us. But we propose to make you and the whole country so sick and tired of the whole business that when the time comes for action, child labor pictures will be records of the past." And of course, today we would say that's true. He succeeded. They did pass a law originally, but it was struck down by the Supreme Court. The Keatings-Owen Act that established the first child labor law standards. It was struck down by the Supreme Court and another subsequent act. But by 1938, we finally passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is still kind of the basis for all the labor laws that we have today. So both Reese and Hine took a project, relentlessly advocated for it to politicians, to people, and both succeeded in making some substantive change in laws. And now I think we come always to the infamous or famous, however you want to think about it, FSA. I mean, in some ways, the images produced for the Farm Security Administration are the greatest collection of photographs ever produced in America. The 20 photographers hired by Roy Stryker included some of the greats, such as, Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Carl Meidens, Arthur Rothstein, Russell Lee, Ben Shane, Gordon Parks, and a much lesser known woman named Esther Bublé. They made more than 270 images, and they still remain probably the enduring legacy for the idea of what an activist documentary project can be. But it was also propaganda. It was really Roy Stryker wanted to raise enough public support from the rich people in the Northeast to support the New Deal. So he sent the photographers out on scheduled assignments. He gave them shooting scripts, and he told them to make dramatic, empathetic, and positive photographs. He told them that they should shoot from eye level to create equality between the viewer and the subject, and they should not demonize the poor. Rather, they should present them as noble and trying to improve their circumstances. So this is one of Lange, the most famous photographs from the FSA, as you probably all know. It's named My Great Mother. The woman is named Florence Thompson, and contrary to Lange's caption, she was not a destitute pea picker. She happened to be in a pea picker camp because she and her partner and their 7 children were traveling by car to try to get to California to pick. The car broke down and it was towed to the pea picking camp. This was actually the original scene that Lange found. So she highly manipulated the picture. She only showed 2 of the children because she didn't think that 7 children would be as sympathetic to the viewers back east as 2 children. It's quite obvious to me anyway that she told the children to turn their heads. She wanted to focus us all on the baby and the face of Florence Thompson, who became like the face of every Depression era mother. This remains the most downloaded photograph from the Library of Congress. Many years later, Florence Thompson, who lived in California, wrote a letter to a newspaper, identified herself as the woman in this photograph. She claimed that Lange lied to her, told her the picture would never be published, and she remained very angry and bitter that she was the only one who didn't seem to have made any money from this photograph. Lange's version was quite different. Lange said that she knew that she knew the picture would help her and the other pea pickers. Of course, Thompson wasn't a pea picker, but I think the two different versions of the story kind of highlight the power imbalance that can exist between the photographer and the person photographed. Again, something that contemporary photographers are very concerned about in sort of on an ethical level of what you're doing. Are you accurately presenting the story? Are you being truthful and fair to the people you're photographing? Lange didn't really care much about that. Walker Evans was the only photographer to photograph with an 8x10 view camera, and eventually he and Agee came together and they did the project that became Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. But when he was still shooting for the FSA before he was fired in 1937, one of his most famous portraits is this portrait here called Floyd Burroughs, a cotton sharecropper. But this is how Walker Evans wanted to see him in his old clothes, his tattered shirt, his torn shirt. But this is how Floyd Burroughs wanted to be photographed with his family. So Evans made this picture. It was never published. They put their best clothes on because they had them. They all have shoes and socks except the little boy on the left. They swept the dirt in front of their house, wanting to say, you know, this is who we are, not just this is who we are. But this photograph was never published. It didn't fit Roy Stryker's idea of what the FSA photograph should be. But I would also say, in addition to being propaganda, the FSA images were quite whitewashed. They were supposed to be showing the circumstances of poor farmers in the Midwest, South, and the West. And the glaring whiteness, like there are no black farmers of any of the photographs that any of us have seen or remember from the FSA, even though Black Americans comprise more than half of the tenant farmers and sharecroppers in the South in the 1930s, but they weren't photographed, or let's more to the point, Roy Stryker wouldn't publish any of them because he didn't think that black farmers would be as sympathetic to the rich white people back in the Northeast. So I think the blame has to reside with Stryker because he also had the habit of punching, as you probably all know, punching a hole in negatives. If he didn't, so they could never be published. But here's a perfect example. The photographers were still kind of subversive and they still shot things that they weren't supposed to. In fact, that's why Walker Evans got fired. But Russell Lee photographed this one particular project. He was supposed to photograph poor black people in Missouri and Mississippi. In this particular community, he was supposed to be showing the success of the New Deal, but instead he actually photographed the truth, which was the shanties, the shacks, which were insulated with newspapers. And he made two almost identical photographs: son of a sharecropper combing his hair, and this picture of a child of a sharecropper. Not surprisingly, this picture of the little black girl was never published, and this is the picture that became the symbol of the poverty that the sharecroppers lived in. So, and then again, that was Roy Stryker. Dorothea Lange was also subversive. This is a picture that is hardly ever seen when we think about Lange's great FSA pictures, but she made this photograph from a very low angle. We know exactly how much power this white plantation overseer has over everything, including his field hands. I think it happens to be one of her most interesting photographs, but again, not a photograph that we see very often or that we've ever seen. So that's just kind of the history of the FSA. I think it was very important, but I think that we can and should rightly criticize the fact that black farmers were not represented at all, and even the few that were actually photographed. Those images, although they exist in the Library of Congress, are not the images that were ever published when you see the collection of FSA photographs. Now, when we move into like the early, like 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, I think one of the photographers that is often left out of history books is Donna Ferrato.
Michelle, I'm sorry, Michelle, can I just jump in?
Absolutely.
Well, first off, by the way, thank you for shattering my illusions of the FSA. That was pretty heavy duty. I had no idea about all that. But could you move your cursor off of the photographs?
Is it off the photograph now?
Now you're perfect. All good.
Thank you.
You so much, Michelle. Thank you
Sorry
so much.
for irritating everyone with my silly little cursor. Donna Ferrato, she was a photographer living in New York, and her work on domestic violence, I think, like Hine and Reese, actually led to some laws being changed. This particular photograph, it was kind of a serendipitous moment. She had been on an assignment, oddly enough, for Japanese Playboy magazine. She was doing a story on a successful couple in Westchester. They lived in a big mansion. They had five children, and they were the examples of like the successful American dream. And she was trying to sort of show the integration of their business life and their personal life. So she kind of lived with them off and on for a year. And one night she was there, and sort of what hidden behind the scenes was that the husband, or they're known by the pseudonyms Garth and Lisa, Garth was actually quite, there was a lot of tension that Ferraro sort of noticed. And one night she was there and she started hearing glass breaking and screaming, and she ran into the bathroom, and you can see her in the corner there with her camera. And that they were so used to her being there, and Garth was so angry or so assuming that he had every right to be beating his wife, that they just paid no attention to the fact that she was in the corner taking these pictures. And this became one of her defining moments, because she had never seen domestic violence. And she decided that she became obsessed with how hidden domestic violence was, even among seemingly wealthy, rich, like ideal couples. This picture became part of a book eventually published by Aperture called I Am Unbeatable. Uh, she launched the I Am Unbeatable campaign to expose, document, and prevent domestic violence against women and children through real stories of real people. So she basically, because of this serendipitous moment and this one picture, this became the cause, or one of the issues, that Donna then spent the next 20 years of her life photographing and advocating for. She lived with family. She spent 6,000 hours riding with police. She actually talked her way into being able to go into battered women's shelters. She talked her way into being able to stay overnight in jails so that she could photograph all the the sides of the story. Her activism didn't end with photographs. She founded a nonprofit foundation called the Domestic Abuse Awareness Foundation. She used her images to raise money for women's shelters. Her nonprofit organization has hosted more than 400 exhibitions and raised millions of dollars for domestic violence education, shelters, to help women get a new start after they leave their abusive husbands. And although the DAA still exists, Donna's not as involved in it anymore. She's working on some other projects. But in 2008, she was honored by New York City. There was a New York City proclamation called Donna Ferraro Appreciation Day for, quote, her service as an example of advocacy and activism, and for being a citizen the city is proud to call one of its own. This is also, I think, an amazing picture that Donna took, called this little boy. The police had come in to, again, no one's paying attention to her. The police had come in, and I love that she took the picture the moment that he's checking the pockets of the abusive father, the mother's here in the background, and the little kid named Diamond is so angry, he's screaming at his father. And then this picture is, again, I think absolutely extraordinary. Donna would say that you can tell who has the power in a relationship by body language. And the little girl is standing submissively with her hands crossed behind her older brother, Ernie, who has already, according to Donna, begun to beat her because he's emulating his parents' relationship. So he is there, with his stick and his stance, and she is already terrified of her brother, and you could say terrified of men. So I think Donna is a very important photographer that doesn't get enough appreciation sometimes. Anyway, now I want to pivot to some of the projects in the book. So I think Jonathan Turgovnik, who's an Israeli photographer who lives in South Africa, exemplifies my definition of what an activist photographer was. In 2006, he was on assignment for Newsweek magazine to photograph HIV, the outbreak of HIV/AIDS in Rwanda. And he started in the course of that project, he met these women, these Tutsi women who had survived the Rwandan genocide, but as rape survivors impregnated by the Hutu rapists, who literally said, we're going to leave you pregnant with, a Hutu, so you'll become an outcast in your village. They infected and the women talked about when Jonathan was photographing them for Newsweek, the complicated relationships they had with these children because they couldn't get abortions or anything like that. So they had the child of their rapist. Some of the women said, "Oh, I loved my child immediately." Others women still can't touch their children. And Turgovnik realized that that was the story that needed to be told. Rape is a weapon of war, and that no one was telling the story. So he came back to the United States. He raised some money. He went back to Rwanda at his own expense, and he started to photograph this project. He made these absolutely stunning color photographs with his Hasselblad of the women and their children, and you can again sort of tell from their body language, whether how they feel about their children. But that wasn't enough. He didn't just it eventually got published as a book called Intended Consequences and was exhibited around the world, but he decided that wasn't enough. So he co-founded with his girlfriend at the time, Jewel Shell, a nonprofit called Foundation Rwanda, which still exists. You could Google it at the end of this. To date, they have, the foundation was specifically founded to raise money to help put these children through school, because there was this weird quirk in Rwandan law. If you were alive during the war, they would pay for you to go to school, but because these children were not born, but rather they were fetuses, they weren't alive during the war, and so they don't count, and they couldn't get government funding for school. So he started this foundation to raise money to send them to school. And to date, they have sent more than 830, and this is probably out of date, let's say as of a year ago, 830 students had graduated from secondary school, and many of them had also enrolled in college. So I would say they graduated, from secondary school or vocational school, and then some of them went on to college. And 20 years later, on the 25th anniversary, he went back and he wanted to find the grown children, because he did extensive interviews with the women, and those interviews are in the book, and it's really the book Intended Consequences. He couldn't interview the children, obviously, because they were children. So he went back and he found them, and he photographed as many as would agree. That generally the ones who wouldn't agree didn't agree because of social media, and they were in college, and they didn't want everyone to know that they had been the children of rape during the Rwanda genocide. But he made this series of diptychs where he would kind of emulate, or sometimes he would try to find the same place they'd been photographed. But then he also photographed them. He had taken pictures of them the first time, but they weren't published, and so he did these diptychs using the pictures he had taken of them when they were children and the same picture taken of them as adults. And this book is called Disclosure: Rwandan Children Born of Rape. And so Jonathan also spoke at the UN on the consequences of rape as a weapon of war. And so it's like this idea that he was on assignment for somebody else, and he said, no, that's not the story that is to be told, and went back and started a foundation. That's the kind of thing that distinguishes an activist photographer, I think, from just a great documentary photographer. Paulimi Basu is a very interesting Indian-born photographer. She lives in the UK. She works on long-term projects almost extensively, specifically this one called Blood Speaks, a ritual of exile, where she exposes the harsh social tradition of Chaupadi, which in India and in Nepal, menstruating women and girls are banished from their homes each month, and they have to go to these shacks or these huts that are community owned, so they're not maintained, and they can only eat if someone's willing to bring them food or water. They're often they're abused. They die from snake bites, and Basu felt so passionate about this. After she made these still photographs, She created virtual reality and multimedia pieces, and she spoke at conferences, she spoke at legislature, she partnered with other nonprofits, also trying to change these laws. And eventually in Nepal, the chapauti is outlawed. Now, whether it still exists, it may still exist, but at least it's actually illegal. She's pretty, and she's done she's done 2 or 3 other projects about issues affecting women in India, but this, I think, was her first major project, and the one that garnered a lot of attention and a lot of praise and awards. Debbie Cornwall, amazing former wrongful conviction lawyer and now a photographer. She produces projects that are more sort of, I would call them constructed documentary. She comes up with an idea and she makes documentary style pictures, but she doesn't hesitate sometimes to control or set them up. She asks, what stories does America tell itself to justify its often unlawful post 9/11 actions? And then this particular project, she discovered that to train soldiers for this time, the war, when this had been the war in Afghanistan, the American military would build fake villages on military bases in the United States, and they would hire like Afghanis who had gotten asylum here, and they would dress them up as insurgents, and they would dress the each American soldier some people had to wear like war wounds. They would act like they're wounded, and they would train in these fake villages, and that's why Debbie calls this necessary fictions. And some of her images are, I mean, this is just a straight documentary image. This one, she would she couldn't photograph their faces, so she would tell them to turn around. This is a woman who, had to act like she'd been injured, and they actually got these Hollywood makeup artists to do really realistic wounds and blood and all that kind of thing. She gained access to 10 military bases in the US to photograph this mock, these mock Middle Eastern villages. Her first book is called Welcome to Camp America, where she actually talked her way into being a photographer in Guantanamo Bay. She, again, couldn't show faces, so the projects have a little more of a constructed kind of look. Anyway, she's pretty amazing photographer. I think I would say the search for new narratives and ways to engage a viewer has also led to some activists to create photo books first and then exhibitions later. And this particular project from a wonderful Dutch photographer named Jan Banning called The Verdict, he lays bare the dysfunctional American legal system by focusing on a particular woman named Christina Boyle, who, like many poor defendants, had poor counsel and was coerced into a plea that she misunderstood. In 1992, her toddler daughter, Amber, died while she was in her boyfriend's care, but somehow Boyer got convicted of the murder of her daughter, even though she unequivocally said she was innocent. She was charged and forced to take an Alford plea instead of, or she faced death. And an Alford plea is kind of a plea where you say you plead guilty. Well, actually, you say you're not guilty, but you admit that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict you, but it counts in prison as an uber guilty plea. So every time you come up for parole, the Alford plea actually counts against you more than if you had simply pleaded guilty. She's still in prison 31 years later. And this is Christina. And Jan Banning met her in prison. He was doing a project on American women in prison, and he started the story, and he's become quite but because a lot of the things about the story, he couldn't actually photograph it because, like, this house, what does it mean? This is where they lived. So for the first time, he made more constructed documentary images, where in the past, his work has been really just beautifully constructed technical portraiture. This, like, is the place where the house was over there in the corner. So the book becomes both his images as well as some of her text, and like this. This is supposed to be, you know, a version of what Amber would have looked like because she was killed in a pink dress. He has gotten no, he's been trying to get this project exhibited in the United States, and nobody will take it because it's too damning of the American legal system. But he's trying to work with lawyers, and he's trying to find ways to put enough public pressure that maybe Christina can get out on parole 30 years later. It's a wonderful, interesting British photographer named Anthony Luvera, who takes activism to a different level. He works collaboratively. He started to work with people in homeless shelters, and he decided rather than just, you know, let them collaborate, he would actually teach them how to take pictures. So he taught them how to use medium format cameras, and it became a participatory project with him as the assistant. That's what he calls them, assisted self-portraits, because you can see in each picture, you'll see a little cable release. So he taught them actually how to take photographs, so they would decide where they wanted to be photographed and how they wanted to look. So in a sense, this project not only shifts the idea of gaze and representation, because the photographed persons are both in front of and behind the camera, but acting as the assistant, Luvera also kind of explores the idea of art as a reciprocal creative act. So this is how he acts. This is him as the assistant. He's standing in, the person's saying, yeah, that's where I'm going to stand. That's how I want to look. And that's how he worked on this project. The work was eventually exhibited in London Underground stations because it was very important for Anthony to have this exhibited in a public place. And he's done a lot of sort of projects kind of that played off of this, this particular person. He met during another project, and she was transitioning. And this is a self-portrait, again, in his assisted self-portrait model of Sarah. But this is from a project called Let Us Eat Cake. And then people would write on their photographs, who are you to judge me? And then the last project I'm going to show you is this amazing project done by Matthew Azalin, who's a Venezuelan French photographer living in Arles. He actually took on Monsanto. He did a 5-year project doing deep dives into Monsanto documents, things he found by understanding how to do really deep research on the internet. It's called Monsanto, a photographic investigation. And it focuses not just on Monsanto's victims, but on the company itself. And he says, and I think this is interesting, he says, it's not about if your work will change the world, it's about thinking of the effectiveness of your work. And he wanted people to actually understand the kind of things that Monsanto does as a corporation, both Agent Orange, the effects, the aftermath, and the current things they're doing. And then, like, so here it's, you know, they discharge toxic waste into a creek in West Virginia. This is in Alabama, this is the kind of stuff that this project. The work became a book, which included his photographs as well as documents, texts, and archival materials that he had found online. So actual Monsanto documents and memos saying that we shouldn't do that or hide this. It's a pretty amazing book. It won the Paris Photo Aperture Foundation First Photo Book Award, and it was a finalist for the Deutsche Borch Photography Prize. But what's quite funny is at the time, Aslan discovered that Deutsche Borch actually got some funding from Monsanto, so he installed a stock ticker at his exhibit that kept the ongoing stock price of Monsanto during the exhibit. And I would say, fitting his practice, he is a member of an NGO called Disclose, which is dedicated to investigative journalism in France. So those are just some of the kinds of projects, from more traditional photographs like Jonathan's or Donna's to these much more contemporary takes on documentary projects that I feature in the book. And that's it. I'm not out of time yet. It's not quite 7.
We can go a little over if you need some extra
That's
time.
fine. I'm happy to take any questions.
I requested some questions from the chat. Anyone can feel free to put those questions into the chat. I was taking some notes alongside, and by the way, Michelle, amazing. I really learned so much, and it was, if I could sum up, fascinating. I can't wait to get the book. But a couple of quick questions I had for you. First, were any of the photographers that you showcased, were any of them your former students?
No, no, no. Oh, that's not true. One of the photographers in the book, Nikki Wu, is a former student. Yes.
Okay. And then my other
But
question
not
is,
the ones in this, not the ones in this presentation.
okay, this is kind of a key question, and yeah, I want to believe that we all have these higher purposes than just having great dinners on this planet, and we should, practice concerned photography, and it's our love photography and whatnot. But here's my question for you: how do you, or do you address it in the book, self-funding? If you see something that you believe that you want to be involved with and document it to affect change, do you recommend anything for self-funding, or how do you get these projects funded?
Well, most of the photographers self-fund, or they start to self-fund, or they get grants, and or they pre-sell projects to magazines. Like Jonathan just self-funded his project, and then it started to sell, and so that money he would put back into it. Most of the photographers, it's just the cycle of funding, grant writing, partnering with other organizations to make sure that the message gets out, and that may lead to other funding. So almost all of them, I'm going to say almost because I would have to run down the names, and are self-funded projects, but through grants as well. I mean, like Debbie, calls herself a professional grant writer. She gets funding from foundations and from grants and projects. Because there's not much other way to do it. Nobody wants this stuff at first until you do it.
Hmm. Maybe can you kind of make one trip, do the work, kind of get a ball rolling? Is that an option as well, to try to
Yeah.
get some of the foundation work done and then get some people to really believe in it?
I mean,
Oh,
that's actually what most photographers do, or they do. Like, there's one I didn't include, an interesting American guy named Michael Snyder. He spends is most of his pre-production is in pre-selling, getting grants, partnering, funding stuff, and then when the pictures come back and the work starts to get published, then more funding comes in. But that's as much as that's pre-production these days for these guys, for most of these photographers.
I'm not getting any questions in the chat, so people are saying thank you very much. So I'm going to ask one more question for you. When you started off with the FSA work and Dorothea Lange and whatnot, it brought to mind Richard Avedon's quote that all photography is a lie. And it's kind of, is there anything that you can recommend a photographer future proofs themselves so that images don't get miscategorized, or the truth of the image is there? Although the FSA guys were kind of having to pander to Stryker and to keep their employment going, but for us that are self-funding and photographers, is there a tool that we can have to imbue more honesty in our images after we take them?
I when I made the joke earlier about AI, I think that this is going to become a far more serious problem, and that we as a community of professional photographers are going to have to come up with different nomenclature. I remember when Photoshop first came out, and magazines would call anything that had been even run through Photoshop a photo illustration. Well, we don't do that anymore because almost everything is run through Photoshop to some degree. But maybe we're going to have to find new terminology. Maybe it's a nonfiction photograph is a true photograph, and a fiction photograph is a photograph that's AI or manipulated. I don't know, but I think it is the better AI becomes, the more important it is that we decide on something, some way to label our photographs, because otherwise they won't be trusted.
Can you turn off your screen share?
I can.
Those are really good points. And maybe to add to that, I found I was on a Facebook group for Nikon vintage cameras, and we buy equipment from each other. And when you ship equipment or you pay someone, you don't know, like eBay kind of makes a safe bubble around you. But I felt very strong telling a person, saying, "Hey, you could Google me. I'm good for it. I have a reputation." Maybe that, in the sense of professional photographers upping their reputation and saying that, if it's a knockaway photo, it's genuine. I mean, I guess until it isn't, there's still other photographers dealing with that. Uh, and I sometimes, when I see it was the Afghan Steve McCurry, I kind of think about, it does hurt your reputation, but maybe we have that. you know, Photography is important, and this is a book that will really show you and elaborate how you can make your photography matter. So thank you so much, Michelle. It's really great to see you again, and so happy to see you're publishing and thriving and continuing along. You have so much to say and help the dialogue.
Well, thank you for asking me, and thank you all for listening. And certainly, if you have questions afterwards, you got my email. You can certainly shoot me a question. I'm happy to continue dialogues with people because I talk fast, and sometimes question comes up afterwards. So I'm happy to continue that. And David, I love what you're doing, and thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it so much, Michelle. And thank you, everyone. We'll see you around the next time.
Bye
Cheers.
bye.